Recording in progress.
Thank you, Chair. We have a quorum and we'll start at 10.
All right, I'll wait for the.
Hey, Paul, you're unmuted.
It's 10:30 it is. We will call this Upper Regional District Planning Committee to order Wednesday, December 4th already, the year. And I'd like to acknowledge we're holding this meeting on the traditional territory of the Tla'amin Nation. Our first order of business is approval of the agenda. Second, Director Gisborne, any discussion on the agenda? Seeing none. Favor? Unanimous. Carried. Next, adoption of the minutes. Sorry, any errors or omissions from our minutes of the last meeting? I didn't see any. So, Director Brander and Director discussion. Favor? Carried. No delegations, I believe. Sorry, are you a delegation? Okay, thanks. Just checking. No unfinished business on our agenda, and we're on to correspondence. There's several items. Would anybody like to? I'm going to pull 6.3. That will make that 7 point. Track that itself. All right.
And I would like to pull 6.4.
Yeah. Any others? All right, well, we'll move to section 7, arising from the correspondence. I guess I'll start with the one that I raised, 7.1. There's a written response to the Savary Shores Improvement District on points raised in their submission. People can read their submission there. It's got several points that they've raised and about impacts about the OCP potentially on their facilities, and then how they can ensure involvement in the OCP. So I don't know if I need a motion to respond. That's for a written response. So. No motion for that.
Yes, thank you, Chair. If you're wanting the bond.
That motion that we second discussion on that, I think it's pretty self-evident from the correspondence. It's carried. Thank you for that. And then Director Gisborne, 7.2 is
Correspondence from Crowther Road Drainage.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. The reason I pulled this is I know that we used to have semi-frequent meetings with Ministry of Transportation. We don't have jurisdiction over the roads that we have done drainage studies. I say it as an example. And when we get this correspondence, should we just be forwarding it along to them? Because unless we're having meetings with them, which is where we can compile it and express our concerns, I would prefer to go that way, but I guess it's a question to our staff. When we get this correspondence in the future, should we just be sending it to Modi or ask them to start meeting with us again?
Well, since that's the question for staff, is Mr. Devereaux available? Sure. No. Our interface with Modi?
Yes, Chair. Correspondence like this are normally automatically forwarded to the Ministry of Transportation and Transit. As Director said, this is not our concern. We don't have a service covering roads in the rural areas.
Who's it?
Thanks, Director Gisborne. I was going to bring it up, but I get a lot of these correspondence because people just don't know where to go. So I typically forward them through to the correct folks, and typically will include Mr. Devereaux if there's anything related to the regional district or a question I have. So yes, Director McCoy.
Question for Mr. Devereaux too. Do they let the local people know, or just the ministry? Do they let like Reno Parisi know about these letters?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Mr. Devereaux is saying, but maybe you could flush that out a bit, Mr. Devereaux.
Yes, through the chair. Uh, Normally, front counter staff, so reception, they have like canned answer with contacts to the local Modi office. If it's a road complaint, they get the 1-800 number to Capilano first, and we give them instructions, report it to Capilano first. If you don't get follow-ups, then go to Modi for or Moat now, sorry, for a response. Um, and it's all we can really do.
Yeah, an example of us facilitating information for our constituents to the appropriate agencies. Continues. Okay, looks like we can move on to section 8. Hello there, Director Elliott. No problem. We're on 8.1. So this is a housing needs report on electoral areas A, B, C, and D. It's an interim update. And before we get to the recommendation, I understand we have a presentation. Maybe Ms. Rodden, you can explain what we're about to see and introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we have online Patricia Maloney, and Patricia Maloney has been working with the Crowther Regional District Planning Department to prepare the required interim housing needs report. And she has a presentation prepared, and I will be sharing my screen.
See how that goes.
And yeah, there'll be time for questions following the presentation. Can everyone see that?
Yes, yeah.
Again, Laura, at the bottom, do you select the presentation button next to, we can currently see,
Code there on the bottom.
so at the bottom, there is, currently it's selected with the notes. It's grayed out at the bottom of the screen, and you'll want to go 3 over to where it looks like a presentation.
Okay.
At the bottom.
No, right at the bottom, right at the very bottom of the screen. Yeah, carry over to the right. More, that one. Nope.
Perfect.
The one that looks like a screen.
Not far
Yeah.
away, folks. So we're just gonna help her out and just so we can actually all
That's
see
the
it.
end. Nope. The one
Which
you
one?
clicked on.
Sorry to interrupt. Yes, you're not sharing this screen, you're sharing this screen right here. So, I think that might be the issue. I'll go see if it was resolved.
Well, that's the same display. We'll get there. We want to see it nice and clear, so. It won't
Sorry.
Apologize for that. There's
Oh,
some
it's no big
quirk
deal.
here.
I'm gonna,
happens in a lot of meetings.
I'm gonna share.
Oh, it's everywhere. Oh, the directors have this as well.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay,
Sorry for the interruption.
take it away, Pat.
Thank you. I think we can go to the second slide then. We're going to give a quick rundown of what we've been doing and why we've done this interim update, the history of it, and some of the next steps. So we can go to the next slide. As Laura said, I'm Pat Maloney. I've been working with Crowther since 2020, actually, when we did the regional housing needs assessment, updated it for you for Crowther in January of 2024. And here we go, updating it yet again. So if we go to the next slide, in January 2024, you completed an updated housing needs report. Next slide. And what we did was we incorporated the 2021 census data. When the 2020 regional housing needs report was completed, we were still using 2016. So in late 23, we got the census figures for 2021 and we updated it. This just shows historical growth that was in that study. And we noted at the time that there were some anomalies, that we felt that possibly the incredibly high growth rate in Area A could have been a COVID-related, previously secondary home people moving to Area A full-time. It showed a very high population increase, but that was what we showed in 2021, and that's what we did the assessment on. So the next slide shows what we did for the projected population for 2028, the projected housing gap. And in the housing needs report in 2024, we broke that down into the type of housing units we were going to need in terms of 1, 2, 3, and more than 3-bedroom housing. This reflects the demographics, the population projections, and the needs of the people in the future. So the next slide is the fact that we have now a requirement to complete an interim housing needs update before December 31st of this year. So next slide. The provincial government adopted new requirements for all municipalities and regional districts to complete an interim housing needs basically by December 31st. This report is required to meet new standardized methodology developed by the University of British Columbia's Housing Assessment Resource Tools, HART, and an outside consultant. HART developed an online calculator and methodology driven by provincial requirements to determine the housing needs for both a 5 and a 20-year period. So the province is very clear that they want municipalities and jurisdictions to look long-term at housing. The 5-year is obviously critical. The further out we project, we know that the less accurate projections are. We can't anticipate everything that happens. The standardized methodology was brought in by the province primarily because municipalities were using different ways of calculating their housing needs, and they wanted something standard, which has brought with it some of its own challenges. So the next slide, the new requirements, there are 6 components that need to be assessed: the extreme core housing need, the housing units and homelessness or unhoused population, housing units and suppressed household information. A suppressed household is a household that would like to live in a separate unit but can't for some reason. At least the methodology assumes they've chosen that they want to have a separate housing unit, and they haven't chosen to be in, for example, a multi-generational household. Housing units and anticipated housing growth is looked at, but not the type of housing unit, just the number of housing units. Housing units and rental vacancy rate, and housing units and demand. Those are the 6 components in the calculation. So if we go to the next slide, there are 2 other things that needed to be calculated. So we needed to do those 6 components for both the 5 and 20 year. The interim update also needed to make a statement about the need for housing in close proximity to transportation infrastructure. And it also needed to have a description of the actions taken by the local government since receiving the most recent housing needs report, which for you is of course challenging because your housing needs report was adopted in January of 24. Didn't give you a lot of time to complete things, but you did, as we'll talk about. So next slide. The 5-year projections for COTHET have identified very few extreme housing core needs, very few persons experiencing homelessness. The suppressed housing formation may appear to be high. The anticipated growth of the number of units that are required is higher than was calculated in your January 24 housing needs report. Additional location demand was 0 because it didn't fit in a rural area. Oh, and vacancy rate adjustment, which is very, very difficult to calculate in a rural area. What this has identified is that the housing needs projections for each of the electoral areas are 80 in the 5-year period, are 86 for electoral area A, 100 for electoral area B, 128 for electoral area C, and 72 for electoral area D. These are significantly higher than the numbers that were calculated in 2024 and may appear to be a bit daunting, but we'll talk about that too. The next slide shows the 20-year projections, basically going through the same thing, a total 20-year housing need of 212 units for area A, 238 for area B, 297 for area C, and 164 for area D. These are new housing units that this methodology has calculated. So next slide. I think we need to talk about the discrepancies and the challenges that this new methodology has caused. So next slide. The actual historical growth rate figures that we saw earlier were, and we know that it might be high for area A, but 26.5% for area A, a little over 14.5% for area B, area C 2.9, and area D 0.6. The provincial methodology uses a regional growth rate, which has combined CAFET with the City of Powell River to give you a regional growth rate, and it was mandated that we use 18.25% over 20 years, or just under 1% growth a year. So I think you'll see that that's not really reflective of the historical growth that CAFET has had. But those are the numbers that have been mandated to be used. So next slide. We also have noted that a rural area, not just CAFET, but most rural areas and regional districts have funding challenges. Most federal and provincial grants, the funding is based on multi-unit affordable housing, which are connected to a piped water supply service and usually a piped sanitary sewer service as well. We know that opportunity is extremely limited in CAFET. Provincial grants for accessory dwelling units are only available to local governments with building bylaws, inspections, and permitting, which we know CAFET doesn't have. And there is no regional housing reserve fund to support affordable housing units. While there is money collected through the vacant home tax and short-term vacation rental, that has been going to other projects and hasn't really had the opportunity to build up a regional housing reserve fund. And with very little development, again, it's very difficult to build that reserve. So next slide. The recommendations that have been developed, take a look at those next slide. So recommendations to reduce housing needs. These are in the report. And you can see that there have been actions taken by yourself and your staff. So support for secondary units in all residential areas. That was done, I believe, in the summer by the regional district. Support accessory dwelling units where provincial septic and water servicing standards can be met. That also has been completed by the regional district. Promote nonprofit housing societies. So right now, CAFET has been very supportive of the Texada proposal, and there's 107 units of affordable housing at various stages of development right now. Next slide. So the other thing is to promote public information on available grants. This is in process. Staff are working on that and looking for advocacy for accessory dwelling unit grants for homeowners. The fifth recommendation is to promote a partnership with HappyPad. This is something that staff are looking at, which would need to be budgeted. develop a process to track rental housing units. This is something that some jurisdictions have. It's a voluntary thing. It would be basically a process where people could put their units in, recognizing that they have rental units. Again, to be budgeted, will take some staff time to do that. Number 7 is to consider the establishment of a regional housing reserve, which would have to be budgeted, and it would have to determine exactly where that money was going, along with goals and objectives as to where that money would be spent. And then the final one is you're going to have to update the housing needs study in 2028, which would have to be budgeted, whether it's staff time or to bring in a consultant to update that. So I think that the next steps that we've got, and we can go to the next slide, the next steps are to accept this report, to continue the implementation of your recommendations, to work with your partners, whether that's HappyPad or the Texada Senior Society or the City of Powell River, and then to plan for an update in 2028. I think one of the things I'd like to say in all the conversations that I've had with the Ministry of Housing, with staff, I think it's important to note that the government is realizing that the methodology that they've developed, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Using regional growth and assumptions for a rural area like Crowther, they just can't be the same as those you would use for the City of Vancouver or the City of Nanaimo or the City of Powell River. And so by 2028, I've been advised by the ministry that we will probably have new methodology. We will have new statistics from Stats Canada with a 2026 census, and these numbers might reflect some changes, and you might see some drops in some of those housing needs. I think the other thing that's important to note is that the ministry understands that a rural jurisdiction has limited ways of getting this housing built. In an urban area, it's a lot easier to zone, to bonus, to incentivize. It's very, very difficult in a rural area. And particularly when we said, when there's no piped water and sewer, you really can't do any kind of intensive development. And so these are the challenges that you face. These would be our recommended next steps. And after that, I'm willing to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do next. Questions. So we'll open it up to the directors for any questions. Director McCullough.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a little concerned about the heart projection, the methodology the government is prescribing, and the fact that it doesn't track well for rural areas. So does that not somewhat skew the results that you're seeing? And how do we move forward understanding that the results, as mandated by the government's methodology, may not be accurate?
Through the chair, I think that's a really good question. I do believe that the methodology has skewed the results. I do think that they're much higher because they have used a regional average. But at the same time, there's no way that the provincial government is going to come back in 2027 or 2028 and say, you didn't meet your housing projections, because there's absolutely no way they can impose that. These are very, very, very strong recommendations on their part. But as I said, they recognize that the methodology is not working for the rural areas. And certainly, Crowther is not the first to have raised these issues with the ministry. And my conversations with staff at the ministry, they've actually asked if I, possibly working with Laura, would write to them and explain why it's not tracking well for the rural area, so that they have that information, so that when they go to modify the methodology for 2028, they will understand better the rural areas. I think that most of the housing growth that the province is focused on is focused in urban areas where you can get a significant amount of units, where you can get higher density, where you have piped water and sewer, where you can actually have transit and active transportation that makes sense to have higher density housing near services. One of the statements in the report addresses how, and the interesting, you're responding to a letter about this, is that Crowther has no control really over transit or transportation. It's out of your hands with BC Transit and the Ministry of Transportation and Transit now. You can't decide that you're going to put in bike lanes. You can't decide you're going to put on 8 extra buses in a week. You know, these things are out of your control. So I think the important thing to note is don't panic. Nobody is going to hold your feet to the fire to get those 100 and whatever units in 5 years. I think they realize that there are issues and that they're going to be realistic about what you can and can't do. And like I said, understanding the constraints that you have and the challenges that you have as a rural area.
Oh, well, thank you. Then, you know, clearly I'm not the only one, we're not the only ones concerned about how this is impacting the numbers for the rural areas. My question is to Ms. Rodden, and that is, do staff feel that, do they share those concerns, and would a letter to the ministry, in her opinion, be the right step to go?
Question, Ms. Rodden.
Through the chair, thank you, Director McCormick. Yes, I think it would help to, you know, if the board were to send a letter to the ministry. As Pat has mentioned, she has had dialogue with Ministry of Housing. I have had dialogue with senior policy analysts at the Ministry of Housing. Many of my counterparts across the province and rural RDs they're finding the same thing. Their projections are so high and they're skewed beyond what the historical growth rates and their prior projections were. So we're not alone in these concerns, and I think it would help to pen a letter.
I move that as an amendment.
Yeah, standalone motion.
Currently.
Yeah, we haven't moved.
We don't have a motion.
Recommendation. This is a discussion part, right? So questions. So keep that in mind, and then move ahead once we're on the recommendation.
Thank you, Chair.
Dr. Elliott.
Thank you. So I had some curiosity about the persons experiencing homelessness, and hearing kind of the methodology was kind of imposed along with the numbers. Is that the case with that as well? Because they don't seem very reflective of anything at all. So I'm like, where did it come from?
Ms. Maloney?
Through the chair, yes, it was part of the methodology. It was part of taking a percentage. I think that probably a percentage of population. I think that probably the city of Powell River has a fairly good idea of an unhoused population, and we did identify a specific number of unhoused people in the Crowther Regional District when we were doing the January 24 update. But using the provincial methodology, the numbers are a bit skewed. I think the other thing to understand is that often the unhoused population in a rural area often goes uncounted and unnoticed. Having lived in a rural area, I know that they can sometimes disappear into the bush. Sometimes they're sleeping on somebody's sofa. They're very difficult to count. But we do, and when services are available, they do tend to gravitate towards an urban area to be closer to services. So I believe the number is skewed, and maybe this time lower than it actually is. So
It is
I agree
considerably
the
lower.
methodology is not perfect.
Yeah.
Follow-up question?
Oh, just, so the numbers are based on nothing at all then? That has anything to do with homelessness? Like it wasn't based on a count, it wasn't based on anything at all?
Been pretty clear about where they're getting it.
Yeah, through the chair, that's correct. It was not based on a count.
Rodden, do you have another comment there?
Well, I'm sure that UBC Heart and the, computer science modelers that developed the tool, they use data, like census data, and I'm sure it was income data and all the demographic data that was used in our January report and in section 5 of this interim housing needs report. So they have a formula, but we don't know what the specifics of that formula is. It's just a tool that every local government now has to use. We don't know what the assumptions are in that tool.
I think we're exposing some of the questions we're going to elicit in our correspondence. Director Southcott.
Question with regard to number 6 on the recommendations, develop process to track rental housing units. My observations of what's gone on in the municipality is that our planning department is basically trying to leave that up to particularly nonprofit housing providers. There currently is a move on to, there's a desire on the part of city council to see housing organization, housing, not a commission, anyway, that would coordinate housing probably within the region, but it would center on the city because the city does recognize that most homelessness focuses on where people are attracted to services. I think the homelessness count also revealed that as well. So the question is there anything behind or any suggestions as to how what process would be employed, or is somebody else using a process that could be copied to track rental housing units? I'm sure that would broaden out into all available housing very quickly.
Ms. Maloney or Ms. Rodden, you're aware of any other tracking methods that have been successful?
The only rural one that I'm aware of is, for example, on Gabriel Island, where People for a Healthy Community have a person who tracks tenants and landlords, and they also actually provide training for both landlords and tenants. But I think it's a fairly informal process. Through the chair, I don't know if Ms. Rodden knows of any others.
Rodden, anything to add?
I do not have anything to add. But it would take staff time to research and see what others are doing and lessons learned and come up with a strategy.
Thank you. I think that's what we've seen in some of these smaller communities, even Savary and other areas like that, where they try to do that informal kind of educational kind of way to get the data, but it has exposed some gaps. I just wanted to add, or maybe a question for Ms. Maloney. So hopefully some new methodology that makes sense to rural areas in 2028, and I hope you're part of that. What was the previous, like the original in January data? How did we acquire that? Can you refresh our memories? Was it the ART calculation or was it something else?
Yeah, through the chair, to answer your question, sir, the data that was used for the 2024 update was through BC Stats and through the 2021 federal census. We used those numbers specifically to track actual growth and numbers, and we used BC Stats actually did the population projections that we used, which we felt were reasonable. I do not have all of their specific assumptions, but they looked like reasonable projections to us. And we did include a 20-year population growth, but we didn't project that into the detailed housing that this new methodology requires. but there's a very long list of other things that a housing needs report has to include, which were all included in the 2024 report.
Thank you. I would hope that the UBC would accept some proactive, constructive additions to their data gathering. So I don't have anything else. Any other? Oh, sorry, Director, something.
Thanks. The term I was trying to remember was housing authority. It really occurs or seems to me to be something that the RD and the city would very well work together on. I'm sure that's what.
Director Gisborne.
Yes, sorry, something in my throat. Thanks for the presentation. A lot of really good information. I really liked how this got into detail. In the report itself on page 62, I think it's the second paragraph, it says to provide affordability, non-conventional forms of housing tenure that may not be captured in the census need to be looked at. And it goes into some greater detail about the survey that our staff did, and I believe, Patricia, you were involved with, around non-conventional forms of housing type. And the 4 electoral areas, Area A, 19 units, Area C was 44 units, Area D was 99 units, and Area B, a whopping 318 units of non-conventional forms of housing tenure. And I'm just kind of curious, what kind of comments do you have on that? And also, because I think that's an indication of something that's going on, at least that I see in my area. We get some low-income people that move out. Later on, I believe page 65, there's some discussion around, property owners may not wanting to have to deal with the provincial tenancy acts and restrictions, whereas I'm aware folks that are in like motorhomes or fifth wheels or on wheels, they're not actually falling under the same category of the Landlord Tenancy Act. So the property owner tends to be a little bit more forgiving in that regards. And I'm just wondering, because when I read that non-conventional form of housing, and of course the methodology that we're running into, it's, that's a conventional methodology that works for municipalities. And now here we are looking at a rural area, and it's like, well, the conventional methodology may not work. And I'm just wondering if, when we write to the Ministry of Housing, we could even point out that, hey, we have a lot of non-conventional forms of housing, and maybe there's something worth looking in there as a difference to how this housing crisis affects our rural areas. Because yes, in a city, it's like, oh, well, we need this many units, you want a 16-story apartment building. How about you go to 20 stories and provide some more housing? Whereas in a rural area, sometimes it's just an application for a granny suite. So I'm just
maybe you have some comments that would make sense to add this. I would say that for Area A, 19 units is probably a little bit erroneous as well. But any comments? I mean, I think we've exposed another gap in Ms. Rodden.
Yeah, Pat may have a comment on this as well, but yeah, that was interesting. It was that Julia Dykstra did the research to support that section, and basically used the ortho imagery, the satellite photos, to identify properties that had multiple units. And unconventional, it's really like RVs and motorhomes. And RVs and motorhomes aren't considered housing under the federal census. So they go uncounted. And it's really interesting because in Venanda, there's been a huge increase in motorhomes. And that's meeting a housing need, but it's unconventional. It's also, in terms of the housing need, housing assessments, it's also considered inadequate because it's not good in the winter for heating. It's not always safe.
Like the next section is adequacy. Right?
Yes.
In the report. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Delaney, or Maloney, sorry, any other comments? I mean, I see you nodding.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Sorry,
through
hold on,
the
Director.
chair. Thank you through the chair. I don't think I have too much to add, but again, having lived in a rural area, you see all kinds of things. where people live, whether it be a garden shed with a extension cord running in, you know what I mean? And one of the concerns with unconventional housing is primarily how the water and sewer is being dealt with. And so that's one of the biggest concerns with it. But at the same time, it is obviously fulfilling a need that is not being met by conventional housing. Thank you.
All right, we're gonna move to the recommendation soon, but this is a good discussion, Director McConnell.
Yeah, one last question. The unconventional housing is something that I think we should make every effort to track when this study is updated. And just for our own information, for the information of the board and for our staff, it would be very useful to know. There was one basic flaw, I think, in the original report that we had, where it said, for example, in Bonanda, there was no new construction. In fact, there were probably half a dozen new houses built, but at the time, the improvement districts, who are aware of all of the construction because they supply the water hookups, et cetera, were not consulted. So moving forward, I would hope that the improvement districts would be consulted to provide more accurate numbers that reflect reality. So if you're ready for a motion, I'm ready to.
I think we should move to recommendation. The planning committee, I think, has had our say, appreciate the other comments, but we're going to move into the recommendation. We'll have a chance to speak to it. So have a recommendation to accept the report. Thank you, Director McCormick. Do I have a second?
I would move that, but I would also add a paragraph that staff be directed to write to the ministry expressing the concerns that we have with the heart of methodology. So
It's a friendly amendment that we've all suggested here. So
that staff be directed to write to the ministry expressing concerns about the heart methodology as it applies to rural areas.
And to be
Two standalone motions.
So we could do this motion first. Committee
Makes it clean.
recommend the board that the board send a letter to the Minister of Housing highlighting concerns.
Does that refer to rural areas?
Hang on. So one question at a time. I think that the intent is as it pertains to rural areas is a good addition. That's what we're looking at. If I see agreement. So does that make sense, folks? Okay, so we could deal with this one first. Thank you. All right, so does this recommendation make sense? Do I have a meeting? This new amendment. Thank you, Director McCormick. Do I have a seconder? Thank you. Any discussion on this? Good one.
Yeah, I'm very happy to support this notion about this letter. I just also like to put my 2 cents in that I would also like it to kind of maybe highlight the non-conventional forms of housing that is occurring in our area as kind of like an example of, hey, this is not a big city. This is something that happens in rural areas, and it's not as much of a like if someone's parking in a motorhome like they downtown Vancouver, it's a huge concern. Whereas in my area, quite often, like you don't even know about it until you take a look at a north of photo from 10,000 feet that you go like, oh, there's some there and some over there. So that's where these blanket policy statements, when you start moving into rural areas, and it's like province might say, well, to solve housing, you need to build some big apartment buildings, and we can go, well, not over 300 units in area B, and our concern might be the water and septic, but that's really Ministry of Health's responsibility. And how can we adjust the formula for our rural areas rather than just being blanketed with the same policy and same methodology of Metro Vancouver? That we are not.
Appreciate your comments. I think we've done a good job of fleshing it out for Mr. Rodden and our staff and our consultants to make a nice, a well-educated letter. Let's have comments on this. Right.
Recommendation, I don't have a vote.
It's okay, go ahead.
As it pertains to unconventional housing and the methodology and recommendations and so forth, the assumption that RVs are inadequate is I think a erroneous one in some cases. But the fact that services need to be there to support water, sewer, and those kinds of things should be looked at more as the thing that needs to happen rather than making people live in a different type of housing. Some people are living in the housing they want to live in, and what they need is good, clean access to potable water and ability to dump their sewers on a regular basis. And so that's what a lot of those housing should be identifying to us, that that's the services that are required. Not that we're trying to make everybody live in a different way.
So that I say bravo. Any other comments on the motion before us? In favor? No, it's carried. So now we can come back to, you can, okay, we can come back to the original recommendation before us to basically accept this report. Move. Director Gisborne. Any discussion on accepting?
Yeah, I like the letter as a response to this report, but I'm wondering what else we can do. And I don't think I'm going to put forward a motion today because I'd like to stew and bounce around like a pinball machine in my head for a bit. But I really do like the information provided around non-conventional forms of housing tenure. And I'm just wondering if, there might be an opportunity here for our like OCPs and zoning bylaws to take a look at the non-conventional forms of housing so that they can be supported and addressed in our rural areas. Because as we've discussed previously, for a lot of our region that doesn't have any zoning bylaws, this is occurring. And then when we bring in, say, a zoning bylaw like on Nootka or Myrtle Pond, we tend to use, best practices and the conventional approach. And what we're seeing is there's kind of a disconnect between the two. So really thankful for this report. And I think that's something that we can look at moving into the future of like, how can we, update our policies or change our policies to more accurately support non-conventional forms of housing. Because I totally agree actually with both Commissioner Maloney and Director Elliott that in some cases, living in a motorhome or an RV can be non-ideal, but yet also at the same time, sometimes it is ideal. University myself, I actually lived in a motorhome in addition to a whole bunch of other types of housing, and actually living in that motorhome is actually the best form of housing that I lived in throughout my entire time. And I'm also a bit of a subject matter expert because I'm actually a landlord for non-conventional housing forms. So I do have to be involved with, septic and water systems. And it's some folks are like, well, can't we just get one? It's like, horses, there's a Ministry of Health requirement there. But I think we can save that discussion for a later date because now we're starting to get into OCPs and zoning and.
Yeah, so thank you, Director Gisborne. I'm just going to say it's an interim report. We got more work to do. We've heard in our last month's meetings, we have homes counts that are going to be underway. A lot of this is going to be before us, and it should be before us as we. So thank you. Any other discussion on the recommendation? Those in favor? Unanimous is carried. Thank you. On to 8.2. Coastal flood adaptation strategy. So it's an update on the public education and communication initiatives for this year. And there is a recommendation basically to again enter this into the minutes and file it. Do we have any discussion beforehand, directors? Recommendation, can I, Director Gisborne, Director McCullough seconded, no discussion? I think, let me just check my notes here. I think I see Ms. Roberts there. Ms. Roberts, really just for folks watching that haven't had a chance to go through it. This is about the training that's available and that's already occurred with coastal flood adaptation. Green Shores, I spent some time in that course last summer and we've had one after that. So maybe you could just flush that out for us.
Yeah, through the chair. So because we're part of the local government working group for Green Shores for Homes, we partner with Green Shores, a stewardship center BC, to offer the Green Shores for Homes certification training once a year. And we change the location every year to try to give equitable access. So last year it was on Savary, and this year it was in Link Bay in August. And I'm sure we'll offer it again next year, but the location is still to be determined.
I encourage people to read the report, and it actually allows people solutions to their foreshore issues, not just the worries that come with them. Any other discussion? All those in favor of the recommendation? Unanimous, carried. Next order of business, we have a referral for a 2-lot conventional subdivision, 3947 and 3961 Cedar Crest Road in Electoral Area B. We have a recommendation before us. Director
Moved.
Seconder. McCormick, discussion. Gisborne.
Not really much to discuss. It's
Okay.
pretty straightforward. It's compliant with the OCP. It's compliant with the zoning bylaw. The one thing though that gives me a little bit of kind of pause is where it talks about, that there's an existing dwelling unit, and after subdivision, there's a kind of a plan to build a new house and then decommission the old one into like a workspace. Right. And it just, in my mind brings up that whole concept of, secondary accessory dwelling unit that is allowed in the OCP, but is not allowed in the Nootka Street zoning bylaw. So I just wanted to flag that it seems like these folks have a structure which can serve as a dwelling unit, but allowed to be used for habitat. Because of the zoning bylaw, my opinion is out of date with the OCP. And, we just had a housing needs assessment, which said, Area B needs a housing units in the next 5 years, and just wanted to flag that. So other than that, I'm going to vote in favor of that.
Any other comments on the recommendation? Very straightforward to me. All those in favor? It's unanimous, and that's carried. All right, just checking my notes here. No new business. Any new business? Okay, should look around. Question period. We have media or anyone else? And you have a question for us? Maybe we'll start with our gallery first.
Curious, do we know a number that with the maximum population that our current infrastructure can support? For the regional district and maybe including the city, just for the whole area, since we are sort of an isolated group.
Ms. Rodden, I don't know if you understood the question. Maybe you could just state your name and where you live, but that's what we normally do.
Town, Area C, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer. So Jennifer's just asking, and it might be a takeaway, but we can get you the information after with Ms. Rodden. Probably the best way, because we have the region, we can break it down for you. So maybe we could do that. Does that work for you?
Yeah, no, just hearing with some of the housing needs, what if we go, what the government is telling us we need. If we overbuild or overgrow to where we have to build a new hospital, it's going to cost,
What's our capacity?
Yeah,
I think that was your question. Yeah. So maybe we'll set you up with staff to take that over and get you some answers. Okay, Ms. Rodden, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I could answer that question, I think, from the delegate. Each of the regional districts' official community plans. So if you live in Area C and you look at the Area C official community plan, there is a section in the first kind of chapter, and it discusses development potential, and there is a map of vacant residential land, an inventory of vacant residential land. So that is at the time that the OCP was completed, and then there is a forecast for, based on the projected population, how many additional lots are required. So that's in each of our official community plans. And in looking at the housing needs report and even the HART projections, there is adequate land to accommodate that growth. The infrastructure is separate because we only have one regional district water service, and that's in Lund. And we only have one regional district sewer service. Oh, sorry, sewer service in Lund, water service in Myrtle Pond. Everything else is either on-site servicing or improvement districts that we have no control or authority over what the carrying capacity of those systems is. But anyways, it's, if you look at each of the OCPs, you'll find, I think, the information you're looking for.
Thanks for the reminder for all of us that it's contained in there. There's a lot of information in our OCPs, so that's a great starting point, and then we can get you any more details as needed. Thank you. Mr. Galinsky, are you online? Any questions?
I'm online, Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I don't have any questions today. Thank you.
Okay. Questions from someone? Okay. No proposed in-camera session. We are adjourned. Thank you.
Good question, though.
That was a good question.